It's a pleasure to be with you. I would have preferred, of course, to visit your campus there in person, but well, it would be for next time, I guess. So my topic today is Korea's national history. I may have chosen another subtitle. It's Decentering China, because as we will see, it's related to the relation between China and Korea. So here's my plan. I'll talk about the necessity to overcome colonial historiography. The second part will be Koreanizing the ancestors, then the Koreanizing the territory, and as a conclusion, I'll show that decentering China for Korean is not such an easy task. And we still see some remains of this Sinocentric view of the world. So let's start with the first part. So as you may know, national history, well, it may seem to something quite evident, but it's national history as a special goal for leaders, for government. It's a tool to increase national solidarity and nationalism. So the narrative, the hero of the narrative is, of course, the nation state. And the nation is considered, is deemed an entity that existed even in a latent state before the realization of the nation state. So you don't need to have a nation state in order to have a nation. A nation can and often pre-exist the nation state itself. Another characteristic of these national histories is that the members of the nation are considered to be the same. For instance, in the case of Korea, they would say that Korean from the ancient times till the contemporary period are one and the same people, you see? And the purpose of national history is usually to extol the unicity, and in the case of nationalist history, even the superiority of the nation. The problem when we talk about Korea's first national history is that usually, well, it should have been the Korean to write the first national history. But in the case of Korea, it was a Japanese who was the first to write a Korean history, modern Korean history. And his name is Hayashi Taisuke. He wrote it in 1892. And the problem with that is that Hayashi Taisuke, like other Japanese historians of the same period, they belong to what we know now as the Japanese colonial historiography, because they had consciously or unconsciously the idea to legitimize Japanese colonial rule over Korea. So it's a big problem for Korean national historians, because one of their first tasks after 1945, after the liberation, was to get rid of this framework of colonial historiography. But it was not an easy task because they had learned with Japanese historians during the colonization. So here are some characteristics of colonial historiography. The main one, and that's the one we'll focus on today, is the idea of heteronomy. It's a term that is used in Japanese and in Korean as well, taeulseong. And it's the idea that Korean history was dependent on China, on Chinese history. Another important idea is that Korean history was stagnant. So there wasn't any progress. Now, one of the problem is to know if this stagnation was because of political reasons or because of ethnic reasons. And in the case of Japanese, their answers was to say that the reason was political. And the reason why they chose to say that it was political, it was a way to legitimize their rule in saying that Korea's stagnation was because Korean dynasties were incompetent. And so they could say that they, now that they ruled over Korea, they could bring progress in Korean history. Another characteristic is factionalism. Japanese historians used to say that Koreans were unable to work together. They would always fight against each other, so they needed the Japanese rule. Shin Tae-ho was one of the first to try to oppose this colonial historiography, and that's why he's considered to be the father of nationalist historiography. And one of his main ideas was to oppose two concepts. The first is 주체. You may have heard about it, related to North Korea. And the other concept is sade. So what is sade? What is 주체? Sade, if you look at the Chinese characters, it means literally serving the great. And here, the great stands for China. So the idea is that Korean throughout their history, they were subordinated to China. And Shin Tae-ho opposed this idea of sade with 주체. 주체, you can translate it by autonomy. It's the idea that Korean can be autonomous. They don't need China. So as examples of sade, there is Kija. Maybe you've already learned about Kija. He was considered one of the ancestral founder of the Korean nation for many centuries. But then he was replaced at the end of the 19th century by the figure of Tangun. So Tangun would represent 주체. Silla, one of the three kingdoms in the southern part of the peninsula, would be representative of sade. We'll see why later. And Shin Tae-ho preferred 고구려, which personified, according to him, the idea of 주체. If we look at language, for those of you who went to South Korea, maybe you've noticed that sometimes the exit sign is written 출구, sometimes even with Chinese characters. But now, more and more, Korean would prefer the 100% Korean expression of 나가는 곳. So 나가는 곳 would be pure Korean, whereas 출구 would be Sino-Korean, and as such, a mark of sade, serving the great, serving China. And if we look at South Korea and North Korea from the North Korean standpoint, well, maybe South Korea would be qualified as a representative of sade. But in contemporary Korea, the great wouldn't be China anymore, but rather the United States. And North Korea, of course, with its idea of 주체, would be the true representative of Chuche ideology. So let's see how the Korean try to colonize their ancestors. If you compare Tangun with Kija, you notice that Tangun is considered to be the founder of Tangun Choson. But as you know, he's the grandson of heaven and the son of a bear, who became a woman. And Tangun is only recorded in the Samguk-yusa. So this in Korean sources. Kija, on his part, is recorded not only in Samguk-yusa, but also in Chinese classics, such as the Analects of Confucius. And he is presented as a relative of King Zhou, who was a ruler of the Shang dynasty, Chinese dynasty. So if I had to bet personally on who was an historical figure between Tangun and Kija, I would choose Kija, probably. But if you look at South Korean history textbooks, here is an example of a textbook from 2011. I haven't checked the recent textbooks, but at least till 2011, you could find in South Korean history textbooks this illustration of Tangun. Tangun, who's supposed to be a myth, but you find him in this textbook, and you find his father flying down to earth from heaven with his ministers. And it's an example of a mix-up of history and myth. So that's what historians sometimes call myth history. This is something you cannot find in Japanese history textbooks. You may know that Japanese history textbooks have been at the center of many controversies between Japan and his neighbors, especially South Korea and China. But in Japanese history textbooks, you'll never find any mention of their founding myth, of Jinmu Tenno or whatever. They mentioned it during the war, but after the war, those mythical elements completely disappeared from Japanese history textbooks. You also have very well-known historians, Korean historians, who would claim that Tangun is not a myth, but the ancestral father of the Korean nation. Lee Byung-do is a representative historians of post-war historiography in South Korea. He is the editor, by the way, of the Samguk-yusa I mentioned earlier. And so you have in circled in red, so he's declaring in 86 in Choson Ilbo that Tangun is not a myth. If you look at the sources, the historical sources mentioning Kija, you have in the Samguk-yusa in blue, you see later Tangun moved his capital to Asadal on Taebaek-san and ruled 1,500 years until King Wu of Zhou, we saw that name earlier, placed Kija on the throne. So that's a Korean source. And in the Shiji, written by the great Han historian Sima Jian, you have this passage. At this, King Wu and fifth, the Viscount of Ji, which is the Chinese pronunciation for Kija, with Chaosian, which is Choson in Chinese. But he did not consider himself a vassal of Zhou. So anyway, you find Kija in Chinese official chronicles. So it doesn't mean, of course, that because of that, Kija is necessarily a historical figure. As a matter of fact, historians think that it's probably a legendary figure. But here is the same Korean history textbook, which says in the Samguk Yusa, it is said that Gojoseon evolved into Dangun, and then Kija, and then Wiman Joseon. And among them, it appears that Kija did not really exist. So as I said, many historians do consider that Kija was a legendary figure. But if Kija is a legendary figure, what can you say about Dangun? So it's quite, it's strange to see this textbook stressing the fact that Kija is a legendary figure, but it suggesting that on the other side, Dangun really existed, you see? Now the third one in this myth history period is Wiman Joseon. Wiman was the founder of this state known as Wiman Joseon, and his name is recorded in the Samguk Yusa, but also in other Chinese classics like the records of the Grand Historian, the Shiji, written by Sima Qian, and the Book of Han, which is a chronicles of the Han Dynasty. What's interesting about Wiman, if we go back to the same Korean textbook, it says that the chronicles report that when Wiman arrived in Gojoseon, he had a bun and wore barbarian clothes. This tells us that Wiman was a man from the Dongyi tribe who lived in China. Dongyi was the term generally used by China to refer to our people. So if you don't know anything about ancient history, Chinese ancient history, then you might think that Wiman was originally a Korean who went to China and then went back to Korea. But the conclusion is that Wiman was a Korean. The problem is that when you look at the Chinese sources, what it says is that Wiman, the king of Chaosian, the king of Korea, was a native of Old Yan. Yan was a kingdom, an ancient kingdom in the northern part of China near Beijing. And then it goes on saying that Wiman fled from his local registry, gathered together a band of more than 1,000 followers, and in the mallet-style hairdo and barbarian clothing, escaped east over the fortifications. There's no mention whatsoever about the Dongyi, the so-called Korean. They just say that Wiman was dressed like a barbarian. But there's no way to conclude that all the barbarians of that period were Korean. You see, so it's it's really weird for a Korean textbook to say, based on those Chinese classics, that Wiman was a Korean. Now let's take a look at the territory problem. As I said earlier, for Shin Che-ho, he opposed Koguryo to Silla. Koguryo was an example of Chuche, and it's because, as you may know, Koguryo resisted successfully to almost 10 Chinese invasions, and so it is often considered a kind of symbol of Korean independence, at least Korean resistance to to Chinese encroachment. On the other side, you have Silla, and Silla was considered by Xin Cheho to be the symbol of this Sade ideology. Why? Because Silla had an alliance with the Tang, the Chinese dynasty, in order to destroy his two rivals, Baekje and Goguryeo. Then, from the end of the 7th century till the beginning of the 10th century, there's a period which is often called Unified Silla. And it's this Unified Silla is often considered to be the first Korean dynasty. But we'll see the problem with this term of Unified Silla. During the Koryo and Joseon period, the historiography was centered on Silla. Why? Because Silla had vanquished his two rivals, so the history that was written was, of course, centered on Silla's victory, on Silla's deeds, and the history was centered around Silla. They gave more importance to the role played by Silla and less to Goguryeo and Baekje. And so in the eyes of Xin Cheho, Silla was a kind of symbol of Korean independence to China, because it had this alliance with the Tang. Nowadays, you still have traces of this difference. You may know that one of the most famous hotel in Seoul is called the Silla Hotel. It belongs to the Samsung Group. And the most famous hotel in Pyongyang is called the Koryo Hotel. So it's not by chance that these they have chosen those two names. In the south, in South Korea, the Silla has a more important meaning than Koryo or Baekje. Whereas in the north, they are proud to consider themselves as the descendants of Goguryeo. I told you before that the term Unified Silla is problematic. Why so? Because if you consider that the period from the end of the 7th century to the 10th century is Unified Silla, it means that Silla unified the whole Korean peninsula. But if you look at this map, you realize that the northern part of the Korean peninsula was ruled by another kingdom called Pare, or Bohai in Chinese. This kingdom of Pare was pretty much ignored during many centuries by traditional Korean historiography. So their main focus was Silla, and so Silla was considered to have unified the Korean peninsula, and so they didn't talk about Pare. But recently, South Korean historians have rediscovered, so to say, Pare, and the reason why they now put much more importance on Pare and Silla, not only on Silla, it's because if you call this period not Unified Silla, but the southern and northern states period, what it means is that Pare is also a Korean kingdom. You see, with Unified Silla, Korean history is limited to the southern part of the peninsula. If you call that period from the 7th century to the 10th century the southern and northern states period, then you include Pare in Korean history. And it's quite important because if you look at the map, you realize that, for instance, Pyongyang belonged to Pare and not Silla. So in a sense, the current situation on the Korean Peninsula with this division already existed during the 7th, 8th century. One of the reasons why Pare was ignored by Korean historians is because of its nature. Was it a Korean state or a Chinese state? The founder of Pare, called Tae-jo-young, he used to present himself as a heir of Koguryo. And in its relations with Japan during that period, Japan also used to call Pare's kings Koryo-wang, that is king of Koryo, or Koguryo-wang, king of Koguryo. It means that in the eyes of the Japanese, Pare's kings were descendants of Koguryo's kings. The problem is that when you look at the population, the elite was probably what you can call a Yemek, that is Korean, ethnic Korean people, descendants of Koguryo. But the main population was Tunggusik, that is Proto-Manchus, that is, in a sense, Chinese. So it is difficult to say if Pare was a Korean state or a Chinese state because it was a kind of hybrid state. But nowadays there are some controversies between Chinese historian and Korean historian about the nature of this state. Was it a Korean state or a Chinese state? This debate, this controversy about the nature of Pare, we find the same problem with Koguryo. At the beginning of the 2000s, there were huge demonstrations in South Korea because of the so-called Northeast project. It was a scientific project led by China, and to put it simply, it was to the aim was to show that all the states which were at the periphery of the Chinese Empire belonged to Chinese history, and so states like Koguryo should belong to Chinese history and not Korean history. So South Koreans took to the streets and they protested. So you see, you see here it says Dongbuk Gongjong. So it's the Northeast Project, and in a way we can say that South Korean rediscovered Koguryo. As I said, their main focus was on Silla, and Koryo was more associated with North Korea. But since these controversies with China, South Korean realized that Koguryo was important to them, to their national history. And so that you have here some manhwa talking about Koguryo and its heroes. And in 2006, there was this drama called Chumong, which was a huge hit in South Korea and even in East Asia in general. You have on the right stamps referring to Chumong, who is considered to be the founder of Goguryeo. There was another aspect of this controversy with Baekdusan. As you may know, half of this mountain is on the on North Korea, Korean territory, and half of it is Chinese territory. The Chinese call this mountain Changbaisan, and the Korean Baekdusan. But during the same period, when there were those controversies about Goguryeo, the Chinese government tried to promote this mountain as a Chinese mountain. So there was this ceremony during the Winter Asian Games in 2007 on the Changbaisan. They built an airport in order to promote tourism on this mountain, but from on the Chinese side, of course. And since 2017, Changbaisan is registered on a tentative list on the World Heritage of UNESCO. The problem, of course, is that, as you may know, Baekdusan is supposedly the birthplace of Tangun, and also the birthplace of Kim Jong-il, the father of the actual leader Kim Jong-un. And this this stamp is a reminder of this idea. You see Kim Jong-il on summit of Mount Baekdu saying Mount Baekdu is my native place. Of course, he wasn't born on Mount Baekdu. He was probably born in the far eastern part of Russia. So these moves from the Chinese side to nationalize, so to say, Changbaisan, to present it as a Chinese mountain. It sparks controversies during the Winter Asian Games. This is I think it was the short track, South Korean short track team. During the medal ceremony, they as a sign of protest, so they wrote that Baekdusan은 우리 땅. So Baekdusan is our territory, and Chinese netizens were quick to make fun of them. I don't know if some of you read Chinese, but it's written 火星也是我们的, which means planet Mars is also ours. So it was the way Chinese made fun of them. So to conclude, I'll say a few words about this idea of Little China. It's to show that this process of decentering China is not over. And you find some remains of this Sinocentric view of the world in South Korea today. So what do we call Little China? As you may know, Choson Korea was basically anti-Manchu. So when the Manchu established the Qing dynasty in China, Choson kings wouldn't recognize them as their suzerain. But so there were two invasions, Manchu invasions, and so Korea had to accept this tributary relation with the Manchu, with the Qing. From the elite, the Yangban standpoint, there were two positions. Some of them were representative of Sozhonghua, this idea of Sozhonghua that we can translate as Little China. And other Yangban were proponents of Bukhak, that we can translate as Northern Studies. So what do we mean by Little China? This idea of Little China, it was mainly among high-ranking literati. It was popular among high-ranking literati. The idea was that the Qing dynasty was not a Han dynasty, so they were not real Chinese. They were Manchus, and so they were barbarians. Because these literati had the same vision of China than the Han Chinese literati. So there was China, and all the states around China were considered to be barbarians. So these literati saw this Manchu dynasty ruling over China. And so their idea was to say that, well, now the real China, big China, is ruled by barbarians. So Korea, we Koreans, we are the last custodian of Chinese civilization, because we share the same Confucian values than Chinese Han literati. So we are, in a way, we are the real China. But we are not big China, we're the little China. And this idea played an important role at the end of the 19th century when Korea was under pressure from Japan and other Western powers to open its ports to trade. And at that time, these literati who had this idea that we are the last custodian of Chinese civilization, we have to protect it. So we cannot open our ports and be influenced by Western learning. And this idea was translated in the slogan, uphold orthodoxy and reject heterodoxy. Orthodoxy meaning here Confucian values, and heterodoxy, Western learning. It's the so-called Wijong Choksa movement. On the other side, you have Northern learning. Here, North means China. This idea was popular among low-ranking literati. They were very pragmatic. They often went to China, they traveled to China, and what they saw is that the Qing dynasty was a very prosperous dynasty. And as such, they thought that it was this China was worth learning. You couldn't dismiss them as barbarians simply because of this ideology of a China-centered world. And this Northern learning is related to what we call the school of practical learning. It's actually it's not a school, but it's a kind of movement. Some literati, Korean literati of the Chosun period, they were more interested in agriculture, all kind of technical problem, rather than this metaphysical debate, you see. And this idea of practical learning, it's been a huge topic, research topic in South Korea for decades now. And the reason why it enjoyed such success is because these historians considered that this so-called school of practical learning was the evidence that Korea knew modernity before the arrival of the Japanese and the Westerners. So in a way, it was an evidence that Korea had this endogenous modernity. They didn't rely on the Westerners or the Japanese to modernize their country. a few examples of one example of this northern learning. This literati called Baxiwan, who traveled to China, and he was very impressed by the Qing technical superiority, and he considered that Korean had to learn from these Chinese. And as an example of his pragmatic view, he used to say that the Chinese, the way they use broken tiles in order to build houses, or animal dung, they use it as manure. All this is a proof of their magnificence, of the magnificence of Chinese. And so he thought that Korean literati had to discard their prejudice and to learn from these Qing Chinese. The problem for high-ranking literati is that they had this image of Qing China. And this Manchu queue was the symbol of the barbarian nature of Qing China. For them to see Han Chinese literati forced to adopt this hairstyle was a humiliation, you see. And so someone like Lee Jong-ui, he was a proponent of the so-called Puppolon, which is the expedition to the north. He thought, like many other high-ranking literati, that Korea should recover Manchuria, because Manchuria was the former territory of Goguryeo. As we saw, Joseon was the legitimate heir of Chunhwa, so Joseon was the little China, because the Qing were the usurper of Chunhwa. They were barbarian. But what is interesting, that Lee Jong-ui thought that if a legitimate dynasty, that is a Han Chinese dynasty, replaced the Qing, then Joseon would lose its right to recover Manchuria. So it's a kind of, it's not a nationalistic irredentism, but it's a kind of civilizational irredentism. It was Koreans' responsibility as custodian of Chinese civilization to recover Manchuria, but not in the interest of the Korean nation. It was to protect the Chinese civilization. And to conclude, I'd like to show you that nowadays you still find some remains of this thinking of Korea as the custodian of Chinese civilization. In 2019, you probably heard that Akihito, the former emperor of Japan, decided to retire. He was too tired. And so his son, Naruhito, became emperor. And as you can see here, you have the Choson Ilbo, the English version of the Choson Ilbo, important newspaper in South Korea. So 1,000 line up to see Japan's emperor. And you have KBS, the news, English news program mentioning Japan's emperor. So nothing unusual. So they're reporting about the enthronement of Naruhito, the Japanese emperor, in 2019. But when you look at the same newspaper, the same television, but in the Korean version, what you see is they use another term, which is ilwang. And ilwang, as you may know, means the king of Japan, not the emperor of Japan. So I don't know if you have any idea why Korean would refer to the Japanese emperor as king of Japan and not emperor of Japan. If you compare with a Chinese newspaper. This is the People's Daily. And it used the Japanese term tenno, tianhuang in Chinese. They don't call the Japanese emperor the king of Japan. So why do you think most of the South Korean media use this term, king of Japan? It's as if, imagine that the French newspapers, French television would call Queen Elizabeth Duchess Elizabeth. What would be the reason for that, according to you? And that's, I'd like to end my presentation with that question. Thank you.